All right, hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling China's economic landscape. And to help us navigate this complex topic, we've got, actually, we're using this paper from the Robert Schuman Foundation. It's called China's Strengths and Weaknesses. It's really going to be our guide, our roadmap as we try to figure out, what makes China tick, where it's strong, and what challenges they're up against.
And it's really important to note that, those weaknesses, those challenges, they don't just stay within China's borders. They actually have a direct impact on the global economy, including, your own country.
Right, yeah, it's not just some far-off story. Okay, so let's start with the wow factor. China's economic growth, it's insane. It's almost like they hacked the system. Back in 1976, they were barely a blip on the radar, just 1% of the world economy. Now, over 7%, and some projections say they could hit 20% by 2025. That's mind-blowing, right?
Yeah, it really is. And that kind of growth, that's what's pushed China to become, the world's second largest economy. And the top dog in both exports and manufacturing.
So we're not just talking about some, regional player here.
Yeah.
This is a major global player, a force to be reckoned with. And their decisions impact businesses and consumers all over the world. The paper actually points out that back in 2006, China accounted for 10% of the EU's total trade in goods, and by 2010, that jumped to almost 14%. So their decisions, their policies, they ripple outwards. But the question is, how did they pull this off? What's the secret sauce?
Yeah, right. Well, there's no single magic bullet, but the paper does highlight a few key ingredients. You've got massive investments, an intense focus on exports, a culture that prioritizes savings, rapid expansion of banking services. They were all part of the recipe.
Yeah.
And they managed to do all of this while keeping their, external debt relatively low.
It's like they found this, this formula that just, it worked. At least it seems to have worked incredibly well for them so far. But the paper also argues that there's a hidden cost to this economic miracle, right? Maybe this rapid growth isn't as sustainable as it seems.
Yeah, I think that's the big question. Definitely there are definitely some cracks starting to show in the foundation. And that's where things get really interesting. China has this ambitious go global strategy. They're acquiring international brands like Volvo. They're investing heavily in companies all over Europe.
So they're not content with just being, the world's factory anymore. They want a seat at the table. They want to be calling the shots. And we're seeing that play out, in places like Zhongguancun. It's like their answer to Silicon Valley.
Right, exactly. Zhongguancun near Beijing has become this major tech hub. It's full of these innovative businesses. It really signifies their desire to move beyond, just making things to actually become a leader in technology and innovation. But here's the thing. Despite all this growth, all this ambition, China's GDP per capita is still lagging way behind developed economies.
So there's like a disconnect there, right? They're this economic powerhouse, but their people, on average, they aren't reaping the same benefits as folks in, say, Europe or the U.S.
Absolutely. And that's a crucial point. It highlights the fact that while China's economic rise is undeniable, they're still grappling with a lot of internal challenges. The paper argues that China needs to make some fundamental changes to their economic model if they want to achieve, true long-term prosperity. They're at a turning point.
And I'm guessing those fundamental changes, those are the challenges we're going to dive into next.
We
Right?
gotta. We're about to explore some of the vulnerabilities that are, that are lurking beneath the surface of this economic giant. Buckle up, because it's about to get interesting.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. I'm ready. So we've talked about this phenomenal growth, but it's not all sunshine and roses, right? This Robert Schuman Foundation paper, it calls out some serious weaknesses in their economic model, and one that really stood out to me was their heavy reliance on exports. It's almost like they've built this incredible economic engine, but it's running on fumes. It's completely dependent on demand from other countries.
Yeah, it is kind of a paradox. This export-driven model, it's propelled them to where they are, but it's also created some pretty significant vulnerabilities. Think about all the waste and all the environmental damage associated with producing, primarily for export.
Right, yeah, the paper uses some really powerful examples to illustrate that, like the Three Gorges Dam, that image of the massive dam is like this symbol of China's power. But the paper uses it to illustrate this darker side to their growth. Sure, it generates a ton of energy, but
Yeah.
it's also been plagued by environmental problems
Yeah.
and questions about, its long-term sustainability.
Yeah, and you have their high-speed rail network. It's the largest in the world. It's a marvel of engineering, really, but it's been, hit with delays, safety concerns, even some high-profile accidents, and it raises questions about whether they, prioritize speed and scale over meticulous planning and execution.
Right? Like, was it all just a little bit too fast? And then beyond those specific examples, you have this broader vulnerability tied to their dependence on exports. I mean, what happens when global demand weakens? That's not something they can control.
Exactly. I mean, we've seen that play out before. Remember the global economic slowdown of 2011, 2012?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, China's exports took a big hit.
And the paper also points out that China has amassed these huge foreign reserves, much of it held in U.S. dollars, which, sounds great on paper, but it makes them susceptible to currency fluctuations and global economic instability, forces outside of their control.
Yeah.
So what's the solution here? What do they need to do to fix this?
Well, the paper argues that, China needs to shift gears and focus on boosting domestic consumption. They need to empower their own citizens to become, the primary drivers of their economy.
Which makes sense. If people in China have more money to spend, they'll buy more stuff, and that will fuel growth, right?
But isn't there a bit of a chicken and egg problem there? I mean, don't they need a strong economy to create that kind of spending power in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it's not as simple as just, flipping a switch. One of the biggest obstacles to boosting domestic consumption is income inequality.
Ah, so we're talking about the gap between the rich and the poor.
Exactly. The paper discusses the risk of falling into what economists call the middle income trap. And it happens when wage disparities, which are often a byproduct of an export-oriented economy, it prevents the emergence of a large and stable middle class.
And without that middle class, you don't have the widespread purchasing power needed to really drive a consumer-based economy, right? It's like a vicious cycle. Right. And the paper uses the GNI coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality to highlight this issue. China's GNI coefficient has been rising, which means the gap between the rich and the poor is widening.
Okay, yeah, the GNI coefficient. I vaguely remember learning about that in some economics class years ago, but refresh my memory. What does a higher GNI coefficient actually tell us?
Essentially, a higher GNI coefficient indicates greater income inequality. So in China's case, it suggests that the benefits of economic growth, they haven't been evenly distributed. And this isn't just an economic problem. It also poses a serious threat to social stability.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if people feel like the system is rigged against them, they're more likely to get frustrated, maybe even angry. It's a recipe for unrest. So we've got these economic challenges tied to their export model, and this whole issue of income inequality. But the paper also dives into these social and geographical disparities within China, right? I mean, it's not just one big, homogenous country.
No, absolutely not. It's a vast and diverse nation, and those disparities are a huge part of the story. You have these prosperous coastal regions that are highly developed, and then you have the less developed inland areas. It's a tale of two Chinas in a way. And then of course you have this massive wave of urbanization that's been happening for decades.
Right. I mean, millions of people are migrating from rural areas to cities. In search of work and a better life. It's like this modern day gold rush. But instead of gold, they're seeking opportunity.
Exactly. And while urbanization can be, a sign of progress, it also creates these enormous challenges. I mean, think about the strain on housing, on infrastructure, on social services. The paper highlights the plight of migrant workers, over 150 million of them, many of whom live in really precarious conditions and lack access to basic social security.
Yeah, it's like this double-edged sword, this rapid urbanization. It's driving economic growth.
Yeah.
But also creating these social problems they're really difficult to solve.
Right. And it's all happening against the backdrop of another major demographic challenge, an aging population.
Right. China's population's getting older. just like in many developed countries.
Yeah, but the difference is the sheer scale and speed of this demographic shift in China. I mean, by 2050, the proportion of people aged 16 over is projected to triple. This means you
Yeah.
know, a shrinking workforce supporting a growing elderly population,
Yeah.
which puts a huge strain on things like pension systems and healthcare.
So it's not just about, boosting GDP anymore. It's about figuring out how to create a more equitable and sustainable society. It's a balancing act.
It is, and that balancing act becomes even more complex when you factor in another major hurdle, China's energy and resource constraints.
Okay, see, this is where things get really interesting for me because we're not just talking about China anymore. We're talking about the entire planet.
Yeah.
China's growing appetite for resources.
Yeah.
It has global implications.
Yeah, I mean they're the world's largest energy consumer, and as their middle class expands, their demand for energy, for food, for raw materials, it will only increase, and this puts immense pressure on global supplies and prices.
It's like they're sucking up resources like a giant vacuum cleaner, and the rest of the world is feeling the effects.
It's a good analogy, and what's even more concerning is that their domestic reserves of key resources like coal, natural gas, and oil, they're dwindling. This means they're becoming increasingly reliant on imports, which makes them vulnerable to price fluctuations and geopolitical tensions.
Right. So they need energy and resources to keep their economy humming.
Right.
But their own supplies are shrinking, and they're increasingly dependent on other countries. That sounds like a recipe for trouble. And then there's the environmental cost of all of this, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The paper paints a pretty grim picture of pollution levels in their rivers and the economic impact of water scarcity. Now they are making some efforts to transition to cleaner energy sources like solar and wind, but their energy efficiency still lags behind many developed nations.
So they're kind of caught between this rock and a hard place. They need to maintain economic growth to meet the needs of their people, but that very growth is putting a strain on their resources, on the environment, and on global stability.
It is. It's a tough situation, and it brings us to what might be their their biggest challenge of all, the need to transition from a production-based economy to one driven by innovation.
So they can't just keep,
Yeah.
churning out cheap goods forever. They need to become a leader in new technologies and ideas.
Exactly. But the paper, it highlights some major obstacles on that path. They have this huge pool of university graduates. But there are concerns about the quality of education and a shortage of skilled workers.
So it's not just about quantity, it's about quality.
Yeah.
They need people who can think critically, solve problems, come up with, creative solutions.
Yeah, and they're struggling to attract back the skilled professionals who've gone abroad for education or work experience. It's a complex problem that requires a fundamental shift in their education system and broader cultural attitudes towards innovation.
So it seems like China is facing this perfect storm of challenges. They've achieved this incredible economic growth, but are now grappling with income inequality, social and geographical disparities, resource constraints, environmental damage, and this imperative to innovate. It's a lot to juggle.
It is, and what's fascinating is that these challenges, I mean, they aren't unique to China. Many emerging economies are facing similar hurdles as they try to balance economic growth with social equity and environmental sustainability. It's just that in China, everything is happening on a much grander scale with much higher stakes.
So we're not just talking about China's future here. We're talking about the future of the global economy.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the complexities of their situation, to see the interconnectedness of it all. I mean, what happens in China, it affects everyone, whether we realize it or not.
Okay, so we've laid out all these challenges facing China, but why should we care? I mean, we're not policymakers in Beijing. What does this all mean for us, the average people listening to this deep dive? That's the question I keep coming back to. Why should we care? What's the takeaway for the average person?
Well, think of it this way. China's economy, it's like a giant ship, sailing across the ocean.
Yeah.
And we're all in these smaller boats just bobbing along in its wake. And when that giant ship hits, rough waters, everyone feels the turbulence.
Okay, I like that analogy. That's pretty vivid. But can you get a bit more specific? Like how do China's challenges actually, impact our lives, our wallets?
Sure, sure. Let's start with the obvious. Trade. I mean, China is the world's biggest exporter, right? And many countries, including, the EU, rely heavily on Chinese goods. So any disruptions to their production or exports, they have ripple effects throughout the global supply chain.
So that new phone or laptop I'm hoping to buy,
Mhm.
it could get more expensive or even harder to find if things go south in China.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just, consumer goods. China is a major player in manufacturing components for everything from cars to medical equipment. So
Yeah.
their struggles, they could lead to shortages and price hikes across a wide range of industries.
Yeah, that's a pretty direct impact. But the paper also talks about China's, growing demand for resources, right? How does that affect us?
Well, think about it this way. When China needs more oil, more copper, more soybeans, it drives up global prices, right? And those price increases, they get passed on to consumers all over the world.
So my grocery bill or my gas bill could go up
Hmm.
because of what's happening in China.
It's certainly a possibility. And then there's the environmental dimension. I mean, China's pollution, it doesn't stay within their borders, right?
Mm.
Air and water pollution, it can travel across vast distances,
I've talked about it.
impacting the health and well-being of people far beyond China.
So we're all breathing the same air, drinking from the same oceans. What they do over there affects us over here.
Precisely. And their efforts to combat climate change and to transition to cleaner energy, I mean, that will have, global consequences as well. If they succeed, it could pave the way for a more sustainable future for all of us. But if they falter, it will make it that much harder for the world to meet its climate goals.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. China's challenges, they're not just their problems, they're our problems too.
That's a crucial realization, and it underscores the importance of understanding, the nuances of China's economic and social landscape. It's not just about watching their rise. It's about recognizing that our fates are intertwined. And this paper from the Robert Schuman Foundation, I think it does a great job of laying out those connections and highlighting the potential risks and rewards for the global community.
So we've explored China's impressive growth, the cracks in their economic foundation, the challenges they're facing, and the global implications of all of this. If you had to boil it all down, what's the key takeaway from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is that China is at a crossroads. They've achieved this remarkable economic success, but are now facing this whole new set of challenges that will require fundamental changes to their economic and social model, and their choices they will have profound implications, not just for their own people, but for the entire world.
So it's not just about China, finding a way to maintain economic growth. It's about finding a way to grow sustainably and equitably in a way that benefits both their citizens and the global community.
Exactly. And that's a delicate balancing act. Will they succeed in making this transition? Will they become a model for sustainable development? Or will they continue down a path that exacerbates, global inequalities and environmental damage? Those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves.
And those are questions with no easy answers. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this thought: how will China's efforts to balance economic growth with social equity and environmental sustainability, how will that impact their global role in the coming decades? Will they become a force for positive change, or will their struggles drag the world down with them?
It's a question worth pondering, and I think the answer lies not just in the decisions made by China's leaders, but in the choices we all make as consumers, as citizens, as members of a global community. I mean, the future, it's not predetermined. It's something we create together.
That's a powerful thought. And on that note, we'll leave you to contemplate those big questions. We encourage you to dig deeper, to learn more, and to engage with these complex issues, because the more informed we are, the better equipped we are to navigate the uncertainties of this interconnected world. Thanks for joining us on this on this deep dive. And until next time, great exploring.